suspension system was introduced about 2,000 years ago. Elastic wheel poles were used to reduce the effect of wheel shock. Later on, Romans invented a two-wheel vehicle called pilantum. This brings the idea of a leaf suspension system, which has dominated as a primary suspension design until fairly recent. Leaf springs offer the benefit of simplicity of design and relatively inexpensive cost. By simply adding leaves or changing the shape of the spring, it could be made to support varying weights. But shall we now move on to some actual dates and facts?
In 1763, a man called R. Trentwell designed and patented the first coil spring. The coil spring offered the advantage of not having to be dismantled, maintained and oiled to stop it from squeaking. In 1804, the modern leaf spring was designed by a man called Mr. Elliot from London. His design consisted of multiple steel plates that were stacked on top of each other and also consisted of varying lengths. These plates were then bolted together and the axle was then bolted to the plates via a U-shaped bolt. In 1817, a famous railway engineer called George Stephenson invented a pneumatic suspension system that was used on British railways. In 1897, Mr. A. Gimmick recorded the first crude shock absorber. His design consisted of a rubber block which was attached to the top of the leaf spring, and when the suspension was compressed sufficiently, the block hit against the bolts which were attached to the frame. In 1898 to 1899, the first shock absorber was introduced on a bicycle. This incorporated the suspension front fork with a friction device that reduced the oscillations when the suspension was activated. Within a year of this being designed, the potential was realised and then was started to be used on cars. In 1907, the first coil springs were used on cars. They were used for the front suspension, but the axle still remained solid.
1990, friction shock absorbers appear in production of automobiles. 1921, the Leyland becomes the first automobile produced with a torsion bar. 1938, Buick becomes the first US manufacturer to use a back-end coil spring. 1982, Peter Wright, a Lotus racing engineer, paints an active suspension system. This system helps to keep the automobile stable during rapid acceleration, braking and turning. In 1985, Nissan releases a Maxima in the Japanese market that was equipped with electronically adjustable shock that respond to road condition, driving style and speed. Okay, enough of this history. Let's now move on and see how the suspension works nowadays and see the physics behind them.
Passive suspension. Passive suspension basically groups together suspension systems that do not change over their life system. This means that they have to be a compromise between ride comfort and handling performance. Basically, the suspension system is made up of spring and a dampening system. The suspension system is basically made up from a spring and a dampening device. Both these are attached between the chassis and the wheel. There are two types of suspension system: an independent suspension system and a dependent suspension system. An independent suspension system basically means that when one wheel moves, the other wheel is not affected by this movement. And on a dependent system, the opposite is correct. An independent system, for example, is the McPherson strut. The McPherson strut can be distinguished as a single unit where the spring has the shock absorber straight down the middle.
When a car hits a bump in motion, the car's forward kinetic energy is converted into vertical energy. This vertical energy is then absorbed by the spring, be it leaf or coil springs. The rate at which energy is stored is called the spring rate. This can be calculated using Hooke's law, where K, which is equal to the spring rate, is equal to the force divided by the extension. The aim of the springs is to keep the tyres on the tarmac.
However, the springs cannot control the car on their own. If there were springs alone, the car would have carried on bouncing down the road out of control. But it didn't. The vertical motion reduced to a controllable amount. This is done by something called a shock absorber. The dampening force created by this device is related to the relative velocity across the piston head. It dampens the system by forcing the piston through the hydraulic fluid. Here we would have viscous effects, and because we are doing work on the fluid according to the first law of thermodynamics,
delta U, which is the internal energy, is equal to the net heat and the network added or taken from the system. This increase in internal energy is dissipated as heat energy. On the right, we have a device that is more commonly used on cars today. It is known as the dual tube damper, where the inner tube is the working cylinder and the outer cylinder is used as a reservoir to store surplus fluid that comes out due to the difference in volumes on either side of the piston.
Semi-active suspensions. This is the intermediate type of suspension between the passive and fully active suspension. This type of suspension first came around in early 70s. With the developments in this type of suspension, this type of suspension can be as effective as fully active suspensions in improving the ride quality. Semi-active suspensions are a lot less complex and less energy consuming compared to the fully active systems. Therefore, they are a lot less expensive. Obviously, the system has been in development since it started, so there are so many different types, but one of the most recent semi-active suspension systems uses the MR and ER fluids as a damper fluid, which are smart fluids containing magnetic particles. In presence of magnetic or electric field, these tiny particles, which are of order of micrometers or nanometers, align themselves along the lines of magnetic flux. Well, the result is chains of particles in direction of magnetic lines, which effectively lock the fluid in its place, making it a viscoelastic solid with higher yield stress. So the way this type of suspension works is by switching the magnetic or electric field on and off whenever needed. This on and off process can be done very quickly in less than a few milliseconds. So with information provided from the sensors placed around the car, suspension system can be controlled in real time. This system also uses a very small amount of energy, only several watts.
This is an experiment which represents a suspension system by having a pivoted bar down the centre, a spring at one end and a damping chamber at the other. This part of the experiment in the middle recreates bumps in the road. When we turn this experiment on, it recreates the bumps and starts the system oscillating. When designing a suspension system, the spring constant and everything has to be taken into account, which then, once finished, gives the system a resonant frequency. And if the resonant frequency of the bumps in the road matches the resonant frequency of the suspension system, it will oscillate more and more and more and more and keep oscillating. So the aim of when designing a suspension system is to take all these things into account and try and shift the natural frequency of the system as high as possible.